Unroll a chart of the Atlantic world as it looked in 1720, not a satellite image. A real one, drawn by hand on calfskin, the coastlines slightly wrong. The compass rose inked in fading gold. The interior of every continent left blank because nobody sailing had any reason to care what was inland. Start your finger at Bristol. Trace southwest, down past the Canaries, across the belly of the Atlantic, where the trade winds push you toward the Caribbean whether you want to go or not. Now you're in the islands. Barbados, Antigua, St. Kitts. Follow the chain northwest through the leewards, past Puerto Rico, past Hispaniola, into the Windward Passage, where the Spanish treasure convoys squeeze through a gap of blue water 40 miles wide. Keep going. Up along the Florida coast, past the reefs that had already swallowed 1,000 ships. Out to Bermuda, sitting alone in the middle of nothing. Then east again, across the whole ocean, down the bulge of West Africa to the slave ports, and around the Cape into the Indian Ocean, up to Madagascar, where pirates built a republic out of driftwood and stolen rum. That is the map. Now here is the part nobody puts on it. Scattered across every one of those routes, at any given moment during the golden age of piracy, there were ships with nobody aboard, drifting. Sails still set, sometimes. Hatches open, food on the table, charts spread out on the navigator's desk with the last position marked in ink that hadn't fully dried. Empty ships. Hundreds of them. Some found. Most never found at all. Sailors called them derelicts when they were being technical. When they were drunk or scared or 3 weeks out of sight of land, they called them something else. They called them ghost ships. And unlike almost every other maritime superstition of the age, this one was not a story. It was a working hazard. It was in the logbooks. It was in the insurance claims. It was in the standing orders that captains gave their crews about what to do when a vessel, with no answer to a hail, came sliding out of the fog. This is the story of the abandoned ships of the Golden Age, where they came from, what actually happened to the people aboard them, and why the sea kept producing them faster than anyone could explain. To understand a ghost ship, you first have to understand something counterintuitive about wooden vessels. They do not sink easily. A modern steel ship that loses buoyancy goes down fast. Steel is heavier than water. Once the compartments flood, physics takes over. But a wooden ship is made of a material that floats: oak, pine, elm, teak. Even fully waterlogged, even with the hold flooded to the deck beams, a wooden hull will often refuse to disappear. It will sit low in the water, awash, rolling with every swell, and it will stay there for weeks, months, sometimes. In a few documented cases, years. Add in the cargo. A ship carrying timber, cork, cotton bales, or empty casks was essentially unsinkable in the short term. Even one carrying sugar or rum had barrels in the hold that displaced water long after the crew gave up. Insurance records from Lloyd's of London in the 18th century list vessels reported abandoned in one part of the Atlantic and then sighted again, still afloat, hundreds of miles away and 8 months later. So the first thing to understand is that when the sea took a crew, it very often did not take the ship. The two events were separate. The men could die of thirst, be swept overboard, be taken by disease, be murdered, or simply climb into the boats and row away. And the vessel they left behind would keep sailing without them. That is the mechanical foundation of every ghost ship story ever told. Wood floats, men do not. Now add the ocean's currents, and you have something genuinely eerie. The North Atlantic runs in an enormous clockwise wheel. The Gulf Stream carries water north along the American coast, then east across toward Europe. Then the Canary Current pushes it south along Africa. Then the North Equatorial Current shoves it west again toward the Caribbean. It is a conveyor belt roughly the size of a continent, and anything floating in it goes for a ride, whether it has a crew or not. In the middle of that wheel sits a region of slack water, almost no wind, almost no current. A vast, still, weed-choked patch of ocean that Portuguese sailors named the Sargasso Sea, after the sargassum seaweed that mats its surface in floating brown fields. Sailing ships that wandered into the Sargasso could sit becalmed for weeks, and derelicts that drifted in tended not to drift out. The Sargasso was, functionally, the Atlantic's junk drawer. Every abandoned hull that survived long enough to be carried by the gyre ended up circling in that dead zone, slowly rotting, tangled in weed, waiting. Sailors in the 17th and 18th centuries did not know about ocean gyres. What they had was the direct, repeated experience of entering that region and finding wrecks. Dozens of them, according to some accounts. Hulls with no masts, masts with no hulls, and occasionally a ship still fully rigged, riding at an angle, with rope on the deck and nobody at the wheel. They concluded, reasonably enough, that something out there collected ships, that there was a place in the middle of the ocean where the sea kept what it took. They were right about the place. They were just wrong about the reason. But the Sargasso only explains where derelicts ended up. It says nothing about how they got empty in the first place. And that is where the Golden Age gets genuinely dark, because there were more ways to loot. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. Choose a crew and keep a ship than most people would ever guess. Start with the most common one and the least dramatic: disease. A merchant ship leaving Bristol or Nantes or Lisbon carried between 15 and 40 men in a space the size of a modern two-bedroom apartment, most of which was filled with cargo. There was no ventilation below deck worth the name. There were rats in the hold by the hundreds. The water in the casks went green within 3 weeks. The food was salt meat and biscuit, and the biscuit had weevils in it by the second month. Into that environment, introduce one man carrying typhus, and you have a closed-system catastrophe. Typhus is spread by body lice, and every sailor aboard had body lice. The disease works fast: fever, rash, delirium, and in a malnourished crew, a mortality rate that could exceed half. Ship's fever, they called it. And a ship that got it in the middle of the Atlantic had no way to isolate anyone, no medicine that did anything, and often no surgeon at all. What happened next depended on how many men could still stand. If enough survived, they threw the dead overboard and sailed on. If not enough survived, the ship stopped being sailed. The sails stayed set because nobody had the strength to take them in. The wheel spun free, and within a few days the vessel had turned broadside to the swell and started the slow, aimless drift that could last for a year. This happened often enough that port authorities across Europe and the colonies developed formal quarantine procedures specifically to deal with it. Ships arriving under suspicion had to fly a yellow flag and anchor offshore for 40 days. That system did not develop out of caution. It developed because vessels kept arriving with a handful of hollow-eyed survivors and a hold full of bodies. And sometimes there were no survivors at all. There are accounts, scattered through Admiralty correspondence and merchant company records, of vessels boarded at sea and found with the entire complement dead in their hammocks. The ship intact, the cargo intact, the crew gone in the most literal, still lying where they fell sense. If you were a 19-year-old sailor rowing across to investigate a silent ship, and you climbed the side, and you went below with a lantern, and you found that, you would not describe it in clinical terms afterward. You would say the ship was cursed, and everyone you told would agree with you. Then there was thirst, which was slower and worse. Fresh water was the single most critical supply on any vessel, and it was also the most fragile. Casks leaked, barrels split in heavy weather. Water went bad from algae and bacteria. A ship blown off course by a storm or becalmed for 3 weeks in the doldrums near the equator could run out. There is a specific pattern that emerges in accounts of ships found with no crew and no obvious damage. The water casks are empty or fouled. The boats are gone. What that tells you is that the men made a decision. They looked at the situation, calculated the odds, and concluded that a longboat rowing hard for the nearest coast had better survival prospects than a becalmed ship with dry casks. Very often, they were wrong. An open boat in the Atlantic with 20 men and no water is not an improvement. But the psychology of it is completely understandable. Doing something feels better than doing nothing. So they climbed down into the boats. They rowed away, and behind them the ship they had just abandoned caught a wind 2 days later and sailed on perfectly well for another 6 months. That is the cruelest version of the ghost ship story. Not a vessel destroyed by supernatural forces, a vessel that outlived the people who gave up on it. Then there is the version that involves pirates, and this is where the record gets genuinely strange. The popular image is that pirates sank the ships they captured. Most of the time they did not, and for a very practical reason. A ship was worth money. Pirates operating in the Caribbean and along the American coast were, whatever else they were, businessmen. A captured merchantman could be sold or kept as a consort vessel or stripped and released. Sinking it accomplished nothing except destroying an asset. What pirates did do was take the crew, not always by force. A merchant sailor in 1718 earned about 25 shillings a month, was beaten routinely by his officers, and had no legal recourse of any kind. When a pirate crew came aboard and offered a share of the plunder, a vote on ship's business, and compensation if you lost a limb, a significant number of men said yes immediately. Bartholomew Roberts himself was a captured third mate who joined and was elected captain within 6 weeks. So picture the aftermath. A merchant vessel is taken. The pirates strip the cargo, take the surgeon and the carpenter and the navigator by force because those skills are irreplaceable, and offer the rest a choice. 10 men join, 6 refuse, and are put in a boat with the captain, who nobody liked anyway. The pirates sail off. What is left behind is a fully rigged ship with an open hold, food in the galley, personal belongings in the sea chests, and nobody aboard. Multiply that across the thousands of ships taken during the peak years of the Golden Age. Roberts alone captured over 400 vessels. Blackbeard, Vane, Rackham, Bellamy, Lowe, England, Every, and dozens of lesser captains together accounted for many thousands more. Not all of those were left empty, but some percentage was. And every one of them became a derelict floating somewhere in the Atlantic with a story that nobody who found it would ever be able to reconstruct. The people who came across those ships later had no idea what had happened. They saw an intact vessel, valuable cargo sometimes still in the hold, meals half-eaten, and no human beings, and they drew the only conclusion available to them, which was that something had come out of the water and taken the crew. There was also the deliberate ghost ship, and this is the part of the history that gets almost no attention at all. Pirates understood psychology better than almost any military force of their era. The Jolly Roger was not decoration, it was a negotiation instrument. A black flag meant surrender now and you will be treated fairly. A red flag meant no quarter. Merchant crews learned to read those signals, and the overwhelming majority of pirate captures involved no fighting at all because the target surrendered on sight. But before you could raise a flag, you had to get close. And getting close meant not being recognized as a pirate until it was too late. So pirates ran false colors. They flew the flags of nations. They disguised their gun ports. They sailed with reduced canvas to look like a slow, fat merchantman. And in some documented cases, they went further. There are accounts of pirate vessels rigged to appear damaged and abandoned. Sails deliberately slack, nobody visible on deck, the vessel apparently drifting. The logic is straightforward and vicious. Maritime salvage law in the period gave enormous rewards to a crew that recovered an abandoned vessel. Find a derelict, put a prize crew aboard, bring her into port, and you could claim a share of the ship and everything in her. That was a life-changing amount of money for a working sailor. So when a merchant captain spotted what looked like a drifting derelict, his first instinct was not caution, it was greed. He would heave to. He would send a boat over with 6 or 8 of his best men, which meant his own ship was now short-handed, and stopped dead in the water with a boat away. And then the men would come up from below on the derelict, and the gun ports would open. How often this trick was used is impossible to establish precisely. Pirates did not keep records, and the men it worked on generally did not survive to write depositions. But Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. Technique appears in enough second-hand accounts, trial testimony, and merchant company warnings that it clearly happened. Some shipping companies issued explicit instructions to their captains not to approach unidentified derelicts under any circumstances, which is not an order you write unless something has gone badly wrong at least once. Think about the effect that had on maritime culture. Every genuine abandoned ship now carried an additional layer of dread. You did not just fear what had happened to the crew, you feared that the crew was still aboard, crouched behind the bulwarks, waiting for you to get close enough, which meant that the correct, professional, sensible response to sighting a derelict was to sail away from it and never find out. And that, in turn, meant that most ghost ships were never boarded. They were sighted, logged, avoided, and they drifted on into the fog, unexplained, becoming stories. Now let us talk about mutiny, because mutiny produced a very particular kind of empty ship. The standard image of a mutiny is a crew rising up, killing the officers, and taking the vessel. That happened. But there was a variant that was far more common and far more relevant here, which was mutiny followed by abandonment. A crew takes the ship. Now they have a problem. They are, legally speaking, dead men. Mutiny was a hanging offense in every maritime nation without exception, and the admiralty courts did not require juries. So the ship they just seized is not an asset. It is evidence. It is a floating warrant for their execution, and it can be identified by any vessel that gets close enough to read her name off the stern. The solution was to get rid of it. Sometimes they burned it. But a burning ship at sea is a signal fire visible for 20 miles, which is a poor choice if you are trying to disappear. More often, they took what they could carry, put it in the boats, and left. They rowed for a coast, sank the boats in a river mouth, walked inland, and became somebody else. And behind them, the ship sailed on, empty, undamaged, with the officers' quarters ransacked and blood on the deck planking, or sometimes with nothing wrong at all except the total absence of human beings. There is a whole category of 18th century derelict reports that fit this pattern exactly. Ship found intact, boats missing, valuables gone, cargo untouched, no damage from weather or combat, no bodies. Investigators at the time frequently concluded piracy. Modern historians looking at the same reports increasingly conclude mutiny, because pirates would have taken the cargo, and the cargo was still there. The men who took only what they could carry were not thieves looking for profit. They were fugitives running for their lives. Then there is weather, which produced the most terrifying variant of all. Rogue waves are individual waves that reach 2 or 3 times the height of the surrounding sea, generated when multiple wave systems align and their energy stacks. They were dismissed as sailors' exaggeration for centuries. Modern satellite and buoy data confirms they are real and considerably more common than anyone believed. A rogue wave hitting a ship broadside can roll her past the point of recovery. But a rogue wave hitting from astern or from the bow does something else. It sweeps the deck. It comes over the rail as a solid wall of moving water, and it takes everything that is not bolted down, including every man standing watch. A merchant ship at 3 a.m. with a light watch might have 4 or 5 men on deck. A single wave could remove all of them in under 2 seconds. The men below in their hammocks would feel the vessel shudder and hear water come down the hatch. And if they were fortunate, they would go up and find the deck empty and start screaming names into the dark. If they were less fortunate, the same wave that took the watch also stove in the hatch covers and flooded the berth deck, and the men below drowned in the dark inside a ship that was still afloat. Either way, the vessel survives. That is the horror of it. The ship, which is the thing you would expect to be destroyed, comes through fine. The people, who are soft and small and standing on an open deck at night, do not. Then the sails, which nobody reefed because there was nobody left to reef them, keep pulling, and the ship keeps going. The sea in the age of sail also produced a phenomenon that has an entirely mundane explanation and an entirely unforgettable appearance: St. Elmo's fire. During electrical storms, when the atmospheric charge builds to a high enough differential, the air around pointed objects can ionize and glow. On a wooden ship, those objects were the mastheads and the yardarms. Sailors would look up during a storm and see blue-white flame dancing on the tips of their own masts, silent, cold, unconsuming. Now imagine that happening on a derelict, a ship with no crew, drifting in a squall, with pale fire burning at her mastheads. Imagine seeing that from another vessel, at night, through rain. That single phenomenon is responsible for a substantial fraction of every burning ghost ship legend in the Atlantic world. The Palatine Light, off Rhode Island. The New Haven ghost ship, the blazing spectral vessels reported off the Carolinas and the Bahamas for 200 years. Sailors were not lying. They were seeing something genuinely there. They simply had no framework for what causes charged air to luminesce, and every framework they did have involved damnation. The same is true of the mirages, which account for the detail that appears in almost every ghost ship account, which is that the ship could not be reached. Temperature layers in the atmosphere bend light. A superior mirage occurs when cold air sits beneath warmer air and light rays from beyond the horizon curve downward, delivering an image of something that is physically below your line of sight. The result is a ship that appears to be floating above the water, distorted, stretched vertically, sometimes inverted, sometimes doubled. More importantly, the mirage shifts as you move. Sail toward it, and the optical geometry changes, and the image retreats or dissolves. Which means that the reported experience of chasing a phantom vessel that stays exactly the same distance ahead, no matter how hard you sail, is not a hallucination. It is refraction. The Caribbean, with its warm shallows and cold deep upwellings, produced these constantly. So did the waters off the Grand Banks, where the cold Labrador Current meets the warm Gulf Stream and generates the most persistent fog bank in the Northern Hemisphere. Every major maritime crossroads of the Golden Age was also an optical illusion factory. But not every ghost ship was an illusion. Some of them were boarded, documented, and are sitting in the archives right now with names, dates, and signatures. In December 1872, a British brigantine called the Dei Gratia was crossing between the Azores and Portugal when her helmsman spotted a two-masted vessel sailing erratically. She was yawing, not holding a course, with some sails set and others missing. The Dei Gratia's captain watched her for 2 hours and hailed her repeatedly. Nothing. He sent a boat. The men climbed aboard and found the Mary Celeste, an American brigantine carrying 1,700 barrels of denatured alcohol from New York to Genoa. The ship was seaworthy. She had 6 months of provisions in the hold. There was ample fresh water. The cargo was intact except for 9 barrels that had leaked. Personal belongings were untouched. The captain's cabin contained a sword, valuables, and the ship's papers, except for the navigation log. The last entry in the daily log was dated 10 days earlier. There was no sign of fire, violence, or serious storm damage. The single lifeboat was missing, and there was evidence that it had been deliberately launched rather than torn away. 10 people had been aboard: Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife, their 2-year-old daughter, and 7 crew. None of them were ever found. Not one body. Not one piece of wreckage from the boat. Nothing ever. The Gibraltar inquiry suspected everything from mutiny to insurance fraud to a plot by the Dei Gratia's crew. All of it collapsed under examination. The most credible modern theory involves the alcohol cargo. Denatured alcohol in wooden barrels expands and vents in warm weather. 9 barrels had leaked. A buildup of vapor in the hold could have produced a pressure release, possibly with a flash of flame that burned off too fast to char anything, and Briggs, a careful man with his family aboard, might have ordered everyone into the boat as a precaution while the hold vented. They would have tied on with a line and drifted astern. And then the line parted, or the wind freshened, and a small open boat found itself watching a fully rigged ship pull away from it into the Atlantic. That is a theory. Nobody knows. What we do know is that the Mary Celeste sailed for 10 days across open ocean, unmanned, and arrived in perfectly workable condition. The ship was fine. The ship was always fine. There is also the Bechimo, which is fully documented and almost more unsettling for it. A steel cargo steamer abandoned in Alaskan ice in 1931 after her crew was airlifted out. Everyone assumed she would be crushed. Instead, she was sighted afloat and drifting again and again for the next 38 years. People boarded her repeatedly. Nobody ever managed to bring her in. The last confirmed sighting was 1969. A ship with no crew, no destination, and no reason to still exist, wandering the Arctic for 4 decades. That is the pattern. Across every century, the vessel persists. So what did all of this do to the men who sailed in the Golden Age? It gave them a coherent, structured belief system about the ocean, and that system was not stupid. It was an accurate model built on incomplete information. They believed that the sea took people and kept ships. That was correct. They believed that a vessel could sail without hands aboard. Also correct. They believed that abandoned ships appeared in specific regions, and they named those regions with reasonable precision. And modern oceanography has confirmed that the Sargasso and the Grand Banks and the Windward Passage do concentrate drifting objects exactly the way the old charts implied. Where they went wrong was on causation. They saw an empty ship and reasoned backward to an agent. Something took these men. Something wanted them. Because the alternative, that the ocean is a system of pressure gradients and thermal layers and disease vectors that removes human beings without noticing they were there, was a far worse thing to believe when you were 3,000 miles from land in a wooden box. A malevolent sea can be bargained with. Sailors threw coins overboard, avoided sailing on Fridays, refused to rename vessels, refused to whistle on deck, and buried silver coins under the mainmast during construction. Every one of those rituals is an attempt to negotiate. An indifferent sea cannot be negotiated with at all. And an indifferent sea was exactly what they were dealing with. The ghost ship was the compromise. It was proof, floating right there in front of them, that something happened out here that had rules they could not see. And rules, even terrible ones, are better than randomness. The derelicts themselves were also a genuine, ongoing hazard. A waterlogged hull sitting low in the swell at night, showing no lights, is effectively invisible. It is also several hundred tons of oak. Collisions between ships and unlit derelicts were a recognized cause of loss throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, and by the late 1800s, navies were actively hunting derelicts and destroying them with gunfire as a public service. The Hydrographic Office published charts specifically tracking known drifting hulls and their estimated positions, updated month by month, so that captains could plot courses around them. There are surviving charts from the 1880s covered in dotted lines showing the meandering paths of abandoned ships across the North Atlantic, some tracked for over a year, wandering in loops and doubling back. Look at one of those charts and you understand the entire legend instantly. Somebody sat down and drew the routes of vessels with no one aboard, not as folklore, as navigation data. The Golden Age ended the way these things always end. Not with a battle, but with paperwork and patrols. The Piracy Act of 1717 expanded colonial courts' power to try and execute. Convoys became standard. Naval squadrons became permanent instead of seasonal. Roberts died in 1722. Rackham hanged in 1720. Blackbeard was killed at Ocracoke in 1718, and his head was hung from a bowsprit as advertising. By 1730, the black flag had effectively vanished from the Atlantic, but the derelicts kept coming. Because piracy was never the main cause, disease was, thirst was, Weather was. Bad decisions made by exhausted men at 3 in the morning were, and none of those went away when the pirates did. Steel hulls eventually solved most of it. Steel sinks. Radio solved more because a ship in trouble could finally tell somebody. Refrigeration and citrus and clean water tanks solved the disease problem. Satellite tracking solved the disappearance problem, mostly. There are still abandoned vessels out there right now. Fishing boats cut loose, cargo ships abandoned by owners who went bankrupt and simply stopped answering the phone, leaving crews stranded in foreign ports for months. Yachts whose owners went overboard. The tsunami of 2011 sent hundreds of Japanese vessels into the Pacific, and some of them were still circulating years later, tracked by satellite, drifting on the same gyre logic that fed the Sargasso 300 years ago. The mechanism has not changed at all, only the materials. And if you were standing on the deck of a merchantman in 1719, somewhere in the Windward Passage at first light, with the fog burning off, and a two-masted vessel came out of the murk half a mile to leeward, with her topsails set and her wheel turning slowly, and no answer to your hail, you would not be thinking about ocean gyres or thermal inversions or the vapor pressure of denatured alcohol. You would be thinking about the 6 men you would have to send over in the boat. You would be thinking about what they were going to find below deck, and you would be thinking about the possibility, small but not zero, that whatever was down there was still alive and waiting for the sound of your oars. The sailors of the Golden Age were not superstitious because they were ignorant. They were superstitious because they had seen these ships with their own eyes, and there was no explanation available to them that made it any less strange. The ship keeps sailing, the crew does not. That was true then, it is true now. And somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, on the slow clockwise wheel that has been turning since before anybody thought to put a sail on a boat, there is almost certainly a hull riding low in the swell tonight, with nobody aboard, going nowhere in particular, and in no hurry to arrive.